Hello. I'm going to be talking about talking to RethinkDB. A couple of months ago, actually maybe like 2 months ago, I wrote this thing called RethinkDB Proxy. And RethinkDB Proxy, as the name says, is a reverse proxy for RethinkDB. Basically what it does is that you could, for example, filter certain types of queries, or only allow access to certain databases or certain tables, right? Because RethinkDB doesn't come with those capabilities, right? And through that process, I learned a lot about RethinkDB's wire protocol, how the drivers communicate with the server, okay? And that's what I'll be talking about. I'll be talking how does RethinkDB drivers talk to the RethinkDB server. So yeah, my name's Jorge. I used to be a developer evangelist at RethinkDB, but I obviously miss it too much, and that's why I'm here. So yeah. So again, 2 topics. We're going to talk about how RethinkDB drivers work, right? What do they do? What kind of messages they use? What do they need to connect to the database? And then we're going to demo RethinkDB Proxy, and you'll see a little bit how RethinkDB Proxy basically uses some of these capabilities in order to filter out RethinkDB queries. So let's say that you want to write a query in RethinkDB, right? As you know, ReQL queries are executed by a driver, right? We don't have a string-based query language. Instead, we use drivers that live in your programming language, and you query the database through that programming language, through that driver. So in this simple example, the driver creates a new connection on localhost and port 28015. And then when that connection comes through, it gets every document in the people table, right? And then just basically console logs that response. The most simple query we can have, basically. So how does this work? First, oh, I forgot. So yeah, basically, RethinkDB has drivers for many different languages. There's maybe more than 10. There's 3 that are supported by RethinkDB officially, but there's a lot of third-party drivers that are basically written by anyone who wants to write one, because we publish how you can communicate with the server, basically. So all drivers communicate with the same wire protocol. That's how we're able to accomplish this. Your driver takes your query and basically transforms it into the wire protocol. So it does a couple of things. Each driver creates connections to the server, serializes your queries into a JSON format that gets sent to the server, and then sends those queries and receives responses. There's other things it does, like keeping track of your change feeds and keeping track of your cursors, and like making sure, like displaying errors and things like that. But these are the 3 main things: creating connection, serializing queries, and sending and receiving query responses. Okay? So let's start with connections. How does a RethinkDB driver connect to the RethinkDB server? If you have this line of code right here, where we import a driver and we try to create a connection, the first thing that your driver will do is establish a TCP connection, right? If we were using Node, this code would look as simple as that, right? It would create a socket using the net module, and then just use connect. Simple enough, right? Let's review a couple of things about TCP connections. TCP stands for Transmission Control Protocol, and it is basically the protocol used in a lot of things. HTTP, SSH, FTP, SMTP, all these things are built on top of TCP. The important thing to know about TCP is that it is reliable. That means if I send a message, that message will get received. It is ordered. If I send 2 messages, that first message will always come first. And it is error checked. So I know that the message that I'm getting is actually the message that was sent, okay? So after we establish that TCP connection, we have to send the server a couple of things for it to know that we want to create a connection. We have to send a version. We have to send the version of the RethinkDB driver so that we can make sure that the driver and server are running on the same version. And I'm not totally sure if it has to be exactly the same version. I think it has to be, I mean, very close, right? But that's kind of the main thing. It needs to send a version. It needs to send an off key, right? This is optional, right? You can send it or not send it depending if you have an off key. And then you have to send the protocol. There are basically only two protocols, if I recall correctly, and those are protobufs and JSON. Protobufs are actually deprecated, so we basically use JSON now. So we take these three things, and then we create buffers for them. This is specific to Node, okay? And I'll explain buffers in a little bit. And we create a buffer for the version. We create a buffer for the length of the off key and the off key so that we know how long that off key will be and we could read it correctly. And then we create a buffer for the protocol version, okay? And then we just send those off to the server, right? So a couple of things about buffers, right? The reason we need to use buffers and not strings is because TCP connection require packets to be sent as binary data, okay? And strings are not very good for binary data. In Node.js, we basically use buffers for binary data. And so that's why you'll see that I convert everything into buffers, okay? So step 3, we have now created a TCP connection. We have sent the version, off key, and protocol. And now we want to listen for a response from the server. So we create a listener on a data event on that TCP connection, and we wait for a buffer with the string success. When we get that, we know that we have a successful connection with the server. Cool. Now we're connected. Now we can actually send a query. So let's say we have this query. We're going to get all documents from the people table. We are going to coerce it to an array, and we are going to run that query. When we run that query, what will happen? The first thing the driver is going to do is it's going to turn that code, it's going to turn that JavaScript into the wire protocol, into basically this weird array that you see here, right? It says 1, 51, 15 array. That 15, for example, references the table term, okay? And that's specified in what's called the protocol definition, which is this like weird file that RethinkDB creates. And let's not get into that right now. You just need to know that the 15 stands for table, and the 51 stands for coerce2, right? And you can see that they're like weirdly like nested inside of each other, right? So like you first get to coerce2, and then the table, and then if there was something else, it would be there, and blah, 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 okay? So that's kind of how it works. So once it serializes that, you can see again the array up here. Well, not up here, up there. We again are going to create a couple of buffers, right? We're going to create a buffer for a token. At least in the JavaScript driver, the token is basically just an integer. It says like it keeps a count, 1, 2, 3, and it basically keeps incrementing, and that will just be the token, okay? So we have a token, we have a query buffer for that query, basically, and then we have a buffer for the length of that query, right? So now we have these three things, and we can send them off to the server, okay? So again, we wait, basically. We have a listener on data, and data will send us back the response. Will send us if there was an error or no error, and it will send us back. It will say, hey, this is the query response for this token, right? So if the token was 1, it'll say, hey, the response for 1 is going to be this, right? Pretty simple. So let's talk about RethinkDB Proxy, okay? Again, RethinkDB Proxy basically proxies communication between driver and server. It filters certain types of queries like inserts and deletes and limits access to the database. So the way this works is you can connect your RethinkDB driver. Instead of connecting it to the server directly, you can just connect it to the proxy, okay? It just establishes that same TCP connection it would establish with the server on a specific port. It will start sending that stuff, right? And what RethinkDB Proxy will do, it will just, for example, when you try to connect, it will just forward that to the server. And then when you actually try to write a query and the driver sends that query, it's actually going to deserialize that query, make sure that everything is okay, that you're not running any commands you're not supposed to run. And then if it is valid, it is going to send that off to the server. If it is not valid, it is just going to send back an error. So that query wouldn't even really reach the server. Okay? Oh, I do this all the time. I actually say what I'm supposed to say and then go next to the slide that says what I just said. So I'm not even going to talk about this. So how would this work? This is basically an npm module, so we could just npm install it. We can start RethinkDB and start RethinkDB Proxy in a certain port. So if we have this query, for example, which creates a connection, gets all users, courses them to an array, and then gets the result, we would get the result, right? Same way. Now, again, keep in mind that that port is the RethinkDB Proxy port, not the RethinkDB server port. So if we, for example, wanted to delete all entries in that table, what would happen is we would get an error, right? Why? Because RethinkDB Proxy read through that query and it said, oh, wait, actually there's a delete term here and you can't delete, so we're just going to throw back an error. That query never got to the server. So let's look at a demo. Let's say, for example, let's create a connection to RethinkDB Proxy. Say host, and we're just going to use a running instance that I have somewhere on the internet, proxy.thejsj.com, port 8125. See if that works. Nope. Oh, because I need to import RethinkDB, right? As R. Now we create that connection, and we have a connection to the proxy. We're going to do the same thing, and well, actually, let's going to create a connection. Let's actually name it correctly, connection to server, and we're going to say r.connect host, and this is some other thing I have running on the internet, RethinkDB, port 28015. Let's see how that works. Cool. So let's say, for example, we want to get, again, everyone in a specific, all documents in a specific table. Or actually, let's just get the count. Let's say we say, you have to trust me that there's actually a table called cities. And I'm just going to get the count, and I'm going to run it. Okay? We get 497. We can also run this with the other connection, with the connection to the server directly, right? And we get the same result, right? It just went directly through the server. So what we're going to do now is that we're going to say, we're going to delete everything, okay? And what's going to happen is that basically this thing throws an error, okay? Cities, ReQL driver error, cannot execute query, delete query not allowed. Cool. So let's go here. Let's make sure that all that stuff is actually there. And let's actually just do the count. 498. Oh, that's a little weird. Well, that's a bug. So I don't know what happened with the number, but it was one off. But now, if we did that same query, if we deleted everything, connection to server, I am actually going to delete it. Now, if I get that, it's 0, right? Like, RethinkDB has no way of saying, like, hey, like, you can't run this query. Like, any query you give it is just going to do it, right? Same thing with, like, DB RethinkDB. So this is our systems table, right? We really don't want random people doing demos accessing this database, right? Let's just get the table list. Let's not be too reckless. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to use my RethinkDB proxy connection. And it will tell, hey, actually, you can't access this database. Sorry. And I mean, that's basically it. I'd love to talk about how complicated this is, but it's actually pretty simple. You can actually look it up on GitHub and see how all these things work. Use it, see if you find it useful. It's actually really good if you want to dig in more into how RethinkDB drivers communicate, because it's just a very simple project that showcases all these different things, right? So yeah, if you have any questions.